Early 1944. The winter air over Dayton, Ohio was sharp enough to sting bare skin, and the concrete of Wright Field shimmered faintly under the frost. Inside the narrow cockpit of a P-51B Mustang, the test pilot wrapped his gloved hand around the throttle, a motion he'd done thousands of times before, but this time, something was different. The placard on the instrument panel read, "War Emergency Power, 67 inches max." Yet the order from the engineers crackled through the headset, push past it. "Let's see what she can do." He eased the throttle forward. The Merlin V1653 engine bellowed, its 12 cylinders roaring like a wild animal breaking its chain. The manifold pressure needle surged, 70, 72, 75 inches of mercury. Every gauge vibrated. Outside, a streak of vapor trailed behind the Mustang as it clawed through the thin Ohio sky. At 25,000 feet, the airspeed indicator swept past 440 mph, then 445, then 448. Down on the frozen tarmac, the engineers at the control van exchanged looks that said everything. This was no incremental gain. This was a breakthrough wrapped in purple-dyed aviation gasoline. The fuel in that tank wasn't ordinary 130-grade aviation gas. It was experimental, labeled simply Grade 150. To the naked eye, it looked like any other fuel except for its faint violet tint. But chemically, it was something entirely new, a liquid weapon forged not by pilots or generals, but by chemists. It had the power to bend the very laws of engine performance, and with it, the fate of the war in Europe. For months, Allied engineers had pushed the limits of what internal combustion could endure. The key was octane, a measure of how much compression a fuel could take before detonating spontaneously. Detonation, or knock, was the silent killer of piston engines, an uncontrolled explosion that could shatter pistons and melt valves. With ordinary fuel, even the mighty Merlin could only handle so much boost before crossing that deadly threshold. But this purple gasoline, it laughed in the face of detonation. As the pilot leveled out, the Mustang held steady at 448 mph. The radio crackled again, his voice calm, almost disbelieving engine stable. "Power's holding. She's smooth. Smooth at 75 inches of manifold pressure." That single word carried the weight of a revolution. The engineers in the van scribbled down data, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. One of them muttered, "This changes everything." He wasn't exaggerating. Because what roared above the Ohio winter sky wasn't just a test flight, it was a prophecy. In that moment, somewhere across the Atlantic, Luftwaffe planners were confident they understood the limits of American aircraft. The Mustang, they believed, was already formidable, but predictable. They knew its range, its altitude, its climb rate. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the Americans were about to rewrite every one of those numbers with a fuel that defied German chemistry. While Germany's best B4 fuel barely touched 91 octane, and its prized C3 blend struggled to match Allied 130-grade American refineries, were quietly brewing something beyond imagination, aviation gasoline, with a performance number of 150. To understand how radical that was, picture this: the standard P-51 running on 130-grade fuel could top out around 437 mph at 25,000 feet. The same aircraft with the same engine flying at the same altitude, but with grade 150, now exceeded 448 mph. 11 extra miles per hour might not sound like much on paper, but in the knife-edge calculus of aerial combat, it was life and death. At that speed, the P-51 was now fast enough to catch or to flee at will. Faster than any frontline fighter the Luftwaffe could field in early 1944. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, Germany's pride, could manage around 400 mph at altitude. The Focke-Wulf 190A, beloved by its pilots for raw power and agility, barely edged 408 mph. Against Mustangs, running 130-grade fuel, German pilots still had a fighting chance. Against Mustangs on 150 grade fuel, they were out of the game before it began. From that test in Dayton, a quiet revolution began, one powered not by steel or gunpowder, but by chemistry. What the world didn't yet realize was that the next great leap in aerial warfare wouldn't come from a new airframe, or a radical wing design, or a secret supercharger. It would come from a color, a faint shimmering purple, and from a handful of chemists who had unlocked the secret to bending physics itself. The war in Europe was about to change, and it wouldn't be because of a new aircraft design or a tactical genius. It would be because of a fuel, a chemical miracle that gave wings to victory. If you've made it this far, you can probably feel that moment in history, the hum of the Mustang, the quiet tension before the throttle goes past the red line. Now I'm curious, what about you? If you were that test pilot at Wright Field in 1944, would you have pushed it beyond the limit? Drop a comment below. Tell me your name, where you're watching from, and what you think drove those men to risk everything for just a few more miles per hour. At Wright Field, the numbers from the test bench told a story clearer than any headline. The P-51 Mustang, already the finest long-range escort in the Allied inventory, had just become something else entirely. On standard 130-grade fuel, its top speed at 25,000 feet hovered around 437 miles per hour. On the new 150 grade, that same airplane, same engine, same pilot cut through the air at 448 miles per hour. 11 miles per hour. To a civilian, trivial. To a fighter pilot, it was the width of survival. In a dogfight, speed wasn't just velocity, it was choice. It meant the power to decide when to fight, when to disengage, when to live. Every extra 10 miles per hour was like adding another revolver to your holster. The Mustang's speed margin turned every encounter into a one-sided equation. A German ace could dive from altitude, commit to an attack, and find the American fighter not where it should be, but gone, climbing away, accelerating beyond pursuit. Across the channel, Luftwaffe tactical maps still painted comfortingly familiar figures. The Bf-109G 400 mph at altitude, the FW-190A about 408 mph under perfect conditions. Their engineers, once proud of that lead, had watched it narrow since 1943. But they reassured themselves the Americans had reached their limit. There was only so much you could wring from a piston engine before physics rebelled. Physics, as it turned out, could be bribed with chemistry. To the Allied test engineers, the implications were staggering. The Mustang's new performance meant that the Luftwaffe's best interceptors could no longer dictate the fight. Even the famous German boom and zoom tactic dive strike, climb away, lost its edge. A Mustang with 150 grade fuel could chase in the climb, something previously unthinkable. For the German high command, this kind of change couldn't be seen on a map, it was felt in the air. Squadron commanders started reporting that the American escorts accelerate unnaturally or continue climbing beyond expectation. These reports would later be dismissed as exaggeration, stress, or morale issues. But the data, unseen, classified, was real. Inside every Merlin-powered Mustang, the magic lay not in metal or propeller pitch, but in what burned inside the cylinders. That purple gasoline, its leaded aroma sharp and sweet, its surface shimmer betraying its potency, was rewriting the playbook of aerial warfare. And the irony was almost poetic. Germany, once the birthplace of Otto and Diesel, the home of early aviation chemistry, was now shackled by its own synthetic fuel program. Its B4 and C3 grades, derived from coal through the Burgess and Fischer-Tropsch processes, were miracles of necessity, but pale against American refinery power. The Reich's chemists fought a losing battle against octane limits and production bottlenecks. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the U.S. oil giants, Standard Oil, Shell, Texaco, were operating like wartime alchemists. Catalytic cracking towers rose from the plains, feeding refineries that never slept. Millions of gallons of 100, then 130, then experimental 150-grade fuel flowed from coastal pipelines into waiting tankers. The difference between 91 and 150 wasn't a statistic. It was strategy. It was the difference between defending and dominating. In a smoky Berlin office, Luftwaffe analysts still plotted expected engagement envelopes, assuming American fighters could reach perhaps 440 mph at altitude. They didn't know those numbers were already obsolete. They didn't know that by the time their pilots took off the next morning, the equations had changed again. Speed, altitude, range, each had been recalculated by a liquid no thicker than syrup and dyed the color of a bruise. And somewhere over the English Channel, the first Mustangs carrying that purple fuel streaked eastward, their Merlin engines singing at a pitch few had ever heard before. The men flying them didn't yet know the chemistry behind their power. They only knew it felt limitless. To their enemies, that limitlessness would soon feel like inevitability. To understand how a mere liquid could tilt the balance of an air war, we must step away from the cockpit and down into the heart of a combustion chamber, a world of heat, pressure, and violence measured in thousandths of a second. Every time a P-51's Merlin engine roared, what really happened inside those cylinders was a carefully choreographed explosion. If that dance ever slipped out of rhythm, if the fuel ignited too early, it turned from music into destruction. The engineers called it detonation. Pilots called it knock. Mechanics called it death. Octane rating was the language chemists invented to measure a fuel's courage under compression. How far it could be squeezed before it broke into chaos. Pure iso-octane, the benchmark, was rated at 100. Anything less meant vulnerability. Anything more, well, more, didn't exist on the octane scale. So the Allies created a new one. Performance number. It didn't break the 100 limit. It leapt beyond it. A performance number of 150 meant that a fuel could survive 50% more compression than pure iso-octane before detonating. In practical terms, that meant more boost, more power, and more speed without melting the engine from within. But how do you make such a thing? That's where chemistry became art. The key was tetraethyl lead, a compound so toxic that even a drop absorbed through skin could cause hallucinations or worse. Yet in tiny, precise doses it performed miracles. It was the conductor of a molecular orchestra, silencing the premature sparks that caused knock and allowing the flame front to move smoothly, in perfect time with the piston's descent. TEL didn't work alone. It needed company aromatic hydrocarbons, like toluene and xylene molecules shaped to absorb the shock waves of combustion like cushions. In a way, these fuels were symphonies in motion. Each molecule had a role, each vibration a consequence. Across 1942 and 1943, this chemistry was tested relentlessly. In British laboratories at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, technicians in white coats and gas masks stirred vats of aromatic fuel components, their glassware stained with the faint violet of dye meant to mark each experimental batch. In America, at Wright Field, and the refineries of Standard Oil of New Jersey engineers ran parallel experiments, sometimes in secrecy, sometimes in cooperation with their British counterparts. Inside those labs, the air shimmered with gasoline fumes and the metallic scent of hot lead. The walls rattled with the hum of test stands, engines running at full throttle for hours until something broke or something didn't. "We're not chasing perfection," one American chemist joked to a colleague, "just something that refuses to explode." Meanwhile, outside those walls, the world was burning. London was rebuilding from the Blitz. Europe was choking under occupation. Yet here, in sterile rooms with beakers and pressure gauges, another kind of war was being fought, one of molecules and patience. By early 1943, the first successful experimental blends appeared. They called it 150 grade, though it wasn't truly 150 octane. The name was more a badge of pride than chemistry, a signal that this fuel could perform half again as strong as the benchmark that had defined aviation fuel for a decade. They dyed it purple for easy identification and perhaps symbolism. Purple, the color of imperial triumph, the hue of bruises, the shade of twilight skies that Mustangs would soon command. Behind the scenes, The effort was monumental. Producing 150-grade gasoline wasn't just about mixing the right compounds. It demanded industrial mastery. Catalytic cracking, a process perfected by Eugène Houdry, a French immigrant engineer working in the United States, was the key. His invention could tear long hydrocarbon chains into smaller, more energetic molecules, yielding the high-octane bases that wartime aviation demanded. The Allies now possessed something the Axis could not imitate: a scalable miracle. The United States had the refineries, the oil reserves, the pipelines, and most importantly, the freedom from bombing raids that allowed all of it to operate without interruption. Germany's chemists, for all their brilliance, worked under bombs and shortages trying to coax quality from coal. So, while Allied pilots would soon climb into aircraft fueled by violet fire, German pilots rolled their planes out to the tarmac and prayed that today's batch of C-3 wouldn't be too thin or too dirty to run full throttle. By the spring of 1943, the stage was set. The scientists had done their part. The molecules were ready. Now the question moved from the laboratory to the sky. What would happen when you poured this new chemistry into an engine built for war? Spring 1943. The test pilots at Wright Field could feel that something extraordinary was brewing, not in secret weapons or new prototypes, but in the fuel trucks that rumbled up the tarmac, their tanks marked with a violet stripe and the stenciled warning, Grade 150, highly leaded. Each flight that week was an act of controlled defiance against physics. The Packard-built Merlin V1650, a masterpiece of Anglo-American engineering, had been designed for reliability and precision, but not for this. At 67 inches of manifold pressure, the engine already screamed through the red line. At 75 inches, it was entering a realm no engineer had dared to calculate. Inside the control van, the test engineers hunched over oscillographs, noting every flicker of temperature, pressure, and revolutions per minute. The hum of the Merlin blended with the soft scratching of pencils on graph paper. A red line traced itself on the screen and stayed smooth. No detonation, no knock, just power. At 75 inches of mercury, the engine sustained full boost for minutes. Horsepower leapt from 490 to 1,720. The Mustang's climb rate shot up by hundreds of feet per minute. And the airspeed needle, that modest instrument of aluminum and glass, ticked past 445 km/h. Astonishingly, the aircraft needed no modification. No new propeller, no extra cooling system, no reinforced cylinder heads. The difference was entirely in the liquid that ran through its veins. The same pilot who flew a P-51 on Tuesday with standard 130-grade fuel could return Wednesday, fill the tanks with 150-grade, and suddenly command a machine that felt transformed, as if someone had swapped its heart overnight. After one of these flights, a test engineer, his face windburned from the runway, chill remarked to a colleague, "Same airframe, same engine, but it feels alive now." That word "alive" captured the sensation every pilot would later try to describe. The throttle felt elastic, the power unending. The Mustang leapt forward with a ferocity that made even veteran flyers catch their breath. In one briefing, General James "Jimmy" Doolittle himself, a pioneering test pilot, before becoming the commanding architect of the 8th Air Force, reviewed the data. Doolittle had long argued that the war would be won not just by planes, but by what powered them. In the 1930s, he had fought bureaucratic indifference to fund high-octane research. Now, in 1943, he was seeing the fruits of that crusade, rendered in horsepower and altitude charts. "Gentlemen," he said simply, "we've just turned chemistry into strategy." While the engineers measured fuel flow and detonation curves, the pilots described sensations, the hum of the Merlin becoming a deeper growl, the subtle change in vibration as manifold pressure climbed. "She's running on velvet," one said. No rattle, no cough, just push. The film reels of these test flights still exist in archives, grainy black and white frames of a Mustang lifting from the runway, glinting in the Ohio sun, its exhaust stacks flashing silver as it tears into the clouds. In one clip, The plane disappears into the horizon so fast that the camera operator loses it. The frame goes blank sky. By late 1943, the results were undeniable. Every controlled test confirmed at 150 grade fuel gave an average speed gain of 25 to 30 miles per hour at altitude, a measurable improvement in climb rate, and an engine response that bordered on supernatural. And yet, behind the excitement, there was caution. Rolls-Royce engineers in Derby and Packard technicians in Detroit warned that running engines at those pressures meant flirting with their mechanical limits. Bearings would wear faster coolant, would boil sooner, and spark plugs would foul more often. Still, as one British engineer dryly put it, engines are cheaper than pilots. The United States Army Air Forces agreed. By the start of 1944, the decision was made: the new fuel would go operational. But not all at once. Secrecy and logistics demanded careful timing. Only selected fighter groups in the 8th Air Force, based in England, would receive the first shipments. Before that could happen, there was one final test flight, the last box to tick before war. The pilot climbed into his Mustang, the purple-stained fuel sloshing in the wing tanks. He glanced at the placard again: War Emergency Power, 67 inches max. Then he smiled. The throttle slid forward. Out on the horizon, the Mustang rose, its silver fuselage glinting in the morning sun, a streak of condensation trailing like chalk on a blue canvas. The radio crackled as his voice came through boost holding. No detonation. Engine smooth. She'll go faster if you let her. And on that cold Ohio morning, as the P-51 pierced the edge of sound that no piston aircraft had yet breached, the quiet understanding settled over the control room. The Allies had found their next great weapon, not in steel, but in science. By early 1944, Europe was on fire, and the U.S. 8th Air Force was bleeding for every mile of sky it claimed. The daylight bombing campaign against Germany, meant to cripple the Reich's industry, was turning into a war of attrition. B-17, Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators roared out of English airfields daily, their formation patterns glinting in the cold sunlight. But too often, half never returned. German fighters, Bf-109s, and FW-190s, waited for them over the Ruhr, over Berlin, over Schweinfurt, diving like hawks into the unescorted bomber streams. Even after the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang in December 1943, American losses were staggering. The Mustang could escort bombers deeper into German territory, yes, but the Luftwaffe still held the initiative. The German fighters could attack, break off, and vanish before the escorts could catch them. What the Americans needed wasn't just an escort. They needed a predator. That's when the order came down from Air Technical Command: deploy grade 150 fuel to combat squadrons in England. The logistics of that decision were breathtaking in scale and in secrecy. The first tankers left the east coast of the United States in May 1944, carrying a liquid more valuable than gold. The journey of that purple-dyed gasoline was its own hidden campaign pipelines across the American Midwest, drums sealed in Norfolk tanker convoys, dodging U-boats in the North Atlantic railcars, through the English countryside to bases like Debden, Leiston, and Bodney. Each container bore a warning stencil: 150 grade fuel. Handle with care, and occasionally a small purple stripe brushed by hand. In the damp English air, ground crews were the first to notice the difference. Smells sharper, one mechanic said, lifting a fuel hose to his nose, like it could bite. They didn't know that what they were smelling was tetraethyl lead, the metallic tang of chemistry, weaponized. Distribution began quietly. Only select units received the fuel: 4th, 354th, 357th Fighter Groups, among others, under Doolittle's supervision. They were told only that this fuel allowed higher manifold pressures and temporary increased performance. The phrase temporary was deliberate, a shield against pilots pushing their engines too far for too long. The timing was exquisite. By June 1944, as the Allies prepared to launch Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the new fuel began to reach operational squadrons. The timing wasn't coincidence, it was design. On the eve of D-Day, as storm clouds swept across the Channel, mechanics, in muddy dispersal bays, filled Mustang's tanks with the purple fuel for the first time in combat. Somewhere on the line, a crew chief watched the violet sheen glimmer beneath his flashlight and muttered, "Looks like grape soda. Smells like the devil." When the invasion began on June 6th, the skies over Normandy swarmed with Allied aircraft, over 11,000 sorties that day. Among them were the first P-51s running on grade 150 fuel. The difference was instant and electric. German pilots, scrambling to intercept, reported unusually fast Mustangs that could climb and dive beyond expectation. For the first time, Luftwaffe interceptors found themselves unable to break contact. The tables had turned. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force had its own reason to celebrate the new fuel. Just as the Allies landed in France, another weapon began terrorizing London, the V-1 flying bomb. Cruising at nearly 400 mph, the V-1 was faster than most fighters could catch, especially at low altitude, where thick air robbed them of speed. RAF squadrons flying Tempest Spitfire, P-51s and Mustang 3s received priority allocations of the 150 grade fuel. It was their only hope to match the V-1's velocity. The scene was surreal. Over the southern coast of England, Spitfires and Mustangs dove on the buzzing missiles, guns blazing. When ammunition ran out, they used their wings literally. Pilots would position themselves inches from a V-1's stubby wing, tilting it just enough to send the bomb tumbling off course. One wrong move, one slipstream too close, and both aircraft could vanish in the same fiery instant. On June 18, 1944, Major R.E. Turner of the 356th Fighter Squadron performed the first confirmed wing-tipping kill of a V-1 using his P-51 to flick the missile into a fatal dive. It required incredible precision, aligning a moving target traveling 400 mph just 6 inches away. The success electrified the RAF and USAAF alike. The trick would be used at least 16 more times that summer. The men who flew those missions said later that they could feel the difference. "She climbs like she's lighter than air," one pilot wrote in his log. "Feels like the Merlin's been reborn." By the time Allied troops were storming the hedgerows of Normandy, their comrades in the skies were waging their own invisible battle, one fought with molecules instead of bullets. And for the first time since 1939, the Allies owned the daylight sky. That victory began not with a new airplane, but with the quiet hiss of purple fuel pouring into a Mustang's wing tank under a gray, English dawn. At first, the German high command refused to believe the reports. Intercept reports from frontline pilots claimed that the new American Mustangs were impossible to outclimb, accelerating unnaturally, and executing dives that should have torn their wings off. Luftwaffe intelligence officers chalked it up to stress exhaustion, or the delusions of men flying against impossible odds. They didn't realize they were reading the first eyewitness accounts of the Allied 150 grade fuel in action. By the summer of 1944, the German fighter force was already reeling. The Eastern Front had drained its best aces. Allied bombers pounded their airfields day after day. Now the sky itself seemed to betray them. To pilots like Gerhard Barkhorn, Erich Hartmann, and Walter Schuck, veterans forged over Russia, the air war in the West felt different, heavier. Hartmann, the blonde knight, once said the secret of survival was to see first, decide first, shoot first. But in the skies over Germany in 1944, American fighters were the ones deciding first. For Luftwaffe ace Gerhard Barkhorn, it was the first time he felt hunted. Years later, he told an interviewer, "They came from above and below faster than the numbers should allow. The Mustangs, those damned Mustangs, they could always choose the fight." Historians would later connect his words to the chemical edge that had quietly changed everything. The purple gasoline that allowed the Merlin to keep boosting, keep climbing, keep chasing. When the first captured P-51s were test-flown after the war, German engineers finally saw it with their own eyes. They measured the manifold pressures, ran the engines on captured fuel samples, and understood too late. The Americans, one chemist wrote in his notes, have achieved what our refineries cannot. But back in 1944, in the heat of the fight, the pilots only felt confusion and disbelief. Over the Rhineland Luftwaffe, Gruppenkommandeurs began ordering their men to attack in massed swarms, Zamisau tactics, hoping that sheer numbers could overwhelm the American escorts. But no amount of bravery could counter an enemy who could simply accelerate out of reach. The skies over Germany were filling with Mustangs that seemed to bend the rules of pursuit. And then came a chilling acknowledgement from the top. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, watching contrails above Berlin, saw silver fighters soaring unopposed alongside the bombers. He turned to his aides and said quietly, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." That moment, often repeated in history books, wasn't hyperbole. It was an admission that the Luftwaffe's strategic logic, its reliance on short-range interceptors, its faith in superior pilot training, had collapsed. The range of the P-51 had already crippled their defensive network. Now, its speed advantage erased the last margin of safety. The irony was cruel. German engineering had produced some of the most advanced airframes of the war, the Bf-109's slender efficiency, the FW-190's brutal power, and even the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter waiting in the wings. Yet all of them depended on fuel the Reich could no longer refine. Coal-to-liquid synthesis kept their machines alive, but barely. Fuel shortages grounded more aircraft than Allied bullets ever did. Training hours for new pilots fell to barely 20 before combat. Meanwhile, in American and British schools, trainees logged hundreds. In the cockpit of a Mustang, an American pilot could push his throttle forward and feel the edge of victory as physical reality, a deeper roar, a smoother climb, a plane that would simply not quit. For a German pilot, that same sound coming from behind was a death sentence. Many Luftwaffe veterans would later describe 1944 as a year of psychological collapse. The confident hunter's instinct that had carried them through the early war turned to dread. Their Messerschmitts were still lethal machines, but they were out of time. One post-war interview with Ace Walter Schuck summed it up. "In Russia, we were the hunters. In Germany, we became the hunted. I could feel their engines breathing down my neck before I ever saw them." It wasn't just the loss of men or machines, it was the loss of hope. The Allies' invisible weapon had broken more than engines. It had broken morale. In the months that followed, Luftwaffe formations grew smaller, their attacks less coordinated. The surviving pilots flew, knowing the truth. Göring had confessed the sky above the Reich no longer belonged to them. And all of it. Every lost sortie, every burning airfield traced back. Not to a new aircraft or secret radar, but to a fuel that burned hotter, cleaner, and longer. A purple fire that turned the hunter's sky into the hunted's grave. The miracle of purple fuel came with a price. Every gallon of 150-grade gasoline carried a hidden enemy inside it. Tetraethyl lead, the same chemical that made it powerful, also made it poisonous. For the men who handled it daily, it wasn't a theoretical risk. It was a metallic taste on the tongue, a headache that wouldn't fade, a cough that lingered in the throat. Yet, in 1944, no one hesitated. The war demanded speed, and the price of speed was lead. On the flight line at Debden or Leiston ground crews began their mornings with the sting of cold wind and the smell of leaded gasoline. They wore stained coveralls, hands blackened by oil and carbon dust, fingers cracked from the chill. To them, the P-51 wasn't a machine. It was a living creature. They fed, cleaned, and coaxed back into the sky. Each maintenance sheet told the same story. Spark plugs fouled faster, cylinder walls wore quicker oil, came back darker. But the pilots didn't complain. "If she runs faster," one said, wiping grime from his face, "she can foul all the plugs she wants." The mechanics learned new rituals. Bins of fresh spark plugs sat beside every dispersal hut. After 2 missions, the old ones came out crusted with white-gray residue. They called it angel dust jokingly, but they knew it was lead oxide. Engine overhauls were shortened. Inspections became almost daily. A careless mistake could turn that power into disaster. Meanwhile, pilots sat through new briefings. They were told in clipped tones how to manage war emergency power with the new fuel. The instructors pointed to the throttle quadrant. You can now go to 75 inches of manifold pressure, but only for 5 minutes. Any longer and you're courting death." The men nodded, half listening. In combat, 5 minutes could feel like eternity, or like nothing at all. For them, grade 150 meant choice. It meant that when a German interceptor latched onto a bomber, they could slam the throttle forward and feel the Merlin surge like a beast unleashed. The airframe shuddered, the noise deepened, the world blurred, and suddenly the enemy was no longer out of reach. One pilot who understood this advantage perfectly was Lieutenant Hollis Bud Nolan of the 357th Fighter Group. On August 6, 1944, flying a P-51D nicknamed Hell's Bells, Nolan joined Operation Frantic, a shuttle mission that took American fighters from England to Soviet bases via Eastern Europe. That day, over the hazy fields of Romania, he spotted a formation of Bf-109s. One German fighter peeled away to meet him, flown by Günther Schack, a skilled Luftwaffe ace. The two closed the distance in a heartbeat. Nolan dove, then pulled into a climbing turn. His Merlin, fed by 150 grade fuel, didn't cough or lag. It surged. He was gaining altitude and speed simultaneously, something unheard of only a year earlier. He fired a short burst. Tracers stitched across the sky, tearing through the German fighter's radiator. Coolant vapor streamed behind the Messerschmitt, but it kept flying. Both men were now low on fuel and ammunition. Nolan broke off, saluted with a wingdip, and turned home. Schack managed to crash land his crippled aircraft near friendly lines. For decades, he wondered why the American had spared him. Only in the 1980s, when historians reunited the two old pilots in Germany, did he learn that Nolan hadn't realized how fatal his hit had been. "I thought he'd just lost coolant," Nolan said. "Didn't want to waste ammo." They shook hands, two men bound forever by a moment defined by chemistry. Schack later told interviewers, "I'd fought Mustangs before, but that one moved differently. He was faster, steadier. It wasn't just a better pilot. It was a different machine." He was right. It was a different machine, not because of its wings or guns, but because of what flowed through its veins. Still, every gain brought risk. The high lead content ate away at engine interiors. Ground crews adapted with grim humor: if she doesn't leak, she's empty. Oil changes doubled, coolant checks tripled, and replacement engines were rushed from depots weekly. Yet pilots begged for the fuel anyway. To them, it wasn't a maintenance issue, it was survival. Flying on 150 grade gasoline turned the Mustang from a finely tuned instrument into a weapon of instinct. Pilots described it as a punch in the back when they pushed the throttle, a raw animal surge that made the horizon tilt and the sky contract. Back on the ground, mechanics listened to engines cooling after each sortie, a ticking metallic heartbeat, and wiped their hands on rags stained purple from the fuel that had made it all possible. They didn't know it yet, but those stains, those burns, and that strange metallic smell were the scent of history being written. The men of the 8th Air Force Mechanics Armorers pilots had become a single organism fueled by courage and chemistry. And in the summer of 1944, that organism began to dominate the sky so completely that even the Luftwaffe's most seasoned veterans could only stare upward in disbelief. The miracle had come at a cost, but it was a cost the Allies were more than willing to pay. By the closing months of 1944, the war in the air had shifted from duel to domination. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a shadow starved of fuel, stripped of veterans, and hunted from the skies it had once ruled. What had begun as a race of aircraft design had become a contest of industrial stamina, and Germany was running on fumes. The Allied bombing campaign had found its most strategic target fuel. From May through August, American B-17s and B-24s hammered the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Merseburg, Pulitz, and Blechhammer facilities that turned coal into aviation gasoline through the Burgius and Fischer-Tropsch processes. Those raids, though costly, were devastatingly effective. By autumn, German aviation fuel output had fallen by more than 80%. Squadrons that once boasted full readiness now rationed takeoffs. Some pilots trained by taxiing their aircraft down runways, pretending to take off, saving what precious drops of C3 fuel remained. Meanwhile, in the United States and Britain, the gears of production sang like an orchestra. Refineries across New Jersey, Texas, and California produced millions of gallons of 150-grade fuel each month. Tankers steamed eastward in endless convoys, braving the Atlantic. Across the Atlantic, railways and pipelines pumped that violet gasoline to forward airfields that now dotted southern England and newly liberated French territory. For every gallon, Germany produced, the Allies made 20. In Leiston, Debden-Bodney, and dozens of other bases, the sound of Merlin engines filled the air like a metallic symphony. A single P-51 group could fly 3 or 4 missions a day, limited only by pilot endurance and mechanical fatigue. Mechanics worked in 12-hour rotations, chain-smoking, and wrenching through the night beneath floodlights. Replacement engines arrived by the truckload. The skies above England never slept. This was industrial warfare in its purest form, factories versus factories, assembly lines against laboratories. While American factories rolled out P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s by the tens of thousands, British plants turned out Spitfire 14s and Tempest 5s, both of which also drank the purple fuel with fierce efficiency. The RAF's 150 wing-flying Tempests from Newchurch became legendary. Between June and September 1944, they shot down 638 V-1 flying bombs, with No. 3 Squadron alone claiming 305. Squadron leader Joseph Barry scored 59 of those kills before dying in a low-altitude chase. Belgian ace Remy van Lierde downed 44 more. The air defense of London, once desperate, became routine thanks to a few more miles per hour gifted by chemistry. Those extra miles per hour weren't just speed, they were time. A Tempest or Mustang on 150-grade fuel could close with a V1 in seconds that would have been lost forever on standard gas. In the world of intercepts, seconds meant lives saved. Back over the continent, the same advantage was now annihilating what remained of the Luftwaffe. German fuel shortages forced the curtailment of pilot training, where a 1940 cadet might have flown 240 hours before combat. By late 1944, the average new pilot barely logged 50. Some went into battle with less than 10 hours on the type they flew. Against them came American pilots, seasoned by months of continuous flying. They had range numbers, and now through the alchemy of grade 150 speed itself. The effect on bomber losses was immediate. Between January and May 1944, before the introduction of the new fuel, Allied bombers suffered 3 to 6% losses per mission. By December, after the widespread deployment of 150-grade gasoline and full air superiority, that rate fell below 2%. The difference represented thousands of airmen who made it home alive. Statistics tell part of the story, but not the feeling. Veterans recalled that by the fall of 1944, the sky belonged to us. What had been a deadly battleground now felt like open country. On some missions over Germany, not a single German aircraft appeared. Others ended with entire Luftwaffe formations obliterated before they could even engage. For the men on the ground in Germany, the change was visible. Once the sky had been streaked with contrails of dueling aircraft. Now, it was dominated by silver Mustangs and Thunderbolts weaving in perfect formation, unchallenged. German civilians began to call them Himmelreiter Sky Riders. In contrast, on German airfields, sleek Bf-109s and FW-190s sat motionless tires deflating under their own weight wings, collecting dust. Their fuel drums were empty, their pilots weary. A single sortie was now a gamble. Every mission might be the last. Across the Atlantic, the American home front hummed with the opposite energy. Women in kerchiefs and overalls worked refinery valves. Welders in the shipyards of Baltimore and New Orleans watched Liberty ships slide into the water faster than U-boats could sink them. Every spark, every drop of oil, every rivet was part of the same invisible engine that powered the air war. When people think of World War II, they imagine tanks and guns. But the real weapon was the assembly line, a chain that stretched from an Oklahoma oil well to the belly of a Mustang flying over Berlin. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was disintegrating. The Me-262 jets, brilliant, fast, and fragile, took to the skies in handfuls, their endurance measured in minutes. Most never reached altitude before Allied fighters pounced. The purple-fueled Mustangs hunted them mercilessly, diving from the sun with speed. Even the jets found hard to evade. In the final months, the once mighty German Air Force had become a ghost. Pilots were running on faith and fumes. The Allies, by contrast, were running on chemistry. And as the world's first true industrial air war reached its crescendo, it was the quiet hum of refineries half a world away that dictated who would rule the sky. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Europe had become one-sided to the point of silence. There were days when the 8th Air Force flew its great bomber armadas deep into Germany and met no resistance at all. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, thousands of aircraft scattered across the Reich, but they were ghosts without fuel, waiting for orders that could never be fulfilled. The few that dared to climb were met by swarms of Mustangs, sleek and silver, running on the now famous 150-grade fuel that had changed everything. The skies that had once burned with dogfights were now highways of victory. And it all began with chemistry. For the pilots, it was hard to articulate what that meant. They weren't thinking about octane ratings or performance numbers as they strapped in. They thought about the smell of oil, the weight of the throttle, the sound of the Merlin engine growling to life. But beneath that growl was the quiet genius of unseen men, petroleum engineers, chemists, and refinery workers, whose work had given those engines their fire. That was the real secret weapon of the Allies' industrial imagination. By May 1945, the numbers told the story with brutal simplicity. The 8th Air Force alone had consumed more than 53 million gallons of grade 150 fuel. Allied refineries had produced more than 200 million gallons. Overall, each gallon refined, tested, shipped, and pumped by hands that would never see combat. The result was air supremacy so complete that even Goering's most loyal officers knew the end was inevitable. German jet fighters, like the Me-262, once seen as the Reich's last hope, arrived too late and in too few numbers. They were fast, but they were starved of trained pilots, starved of resources, and most of all, starved of fuel. Each flight risked empty tanks before the mission even began. Their opponents, the Allied Mustangs and Thunderbolts, could afford to fly 3 sorties a day, refueled, and ready limited only by pilot fatigue and daylight. It wasn't just a victory of the air, it was a victory of capacity. A Mustang on 150-grade fuel could climb higher, fly farther, and decide when to fight or flee. A German pilot on dwindling C3 fuel had none of those choices. One side fought with abundance, the other with desperation. And in modern war, that difference was everything. When the end finally came, May 8, 1945, VE Day, the airfields of Germany were littered with the wreckage of a vanished dream, twisted wings, empty fuel drums burned out, Me-109s, their once proud black crosses faded under soot. The men who had once called themselves Himmelritter Knights of the Sky now watched the silver trails of Allied fighters above and knew the truth. The sky belonged to someone else. But in the afterglow of victory, the chemists and engineers who made it possible remained largely anonymous. They hadn't fired a shot, but they'd built a weapon as decisive as any bomb. That faint, violet hue in a fuel tank had meant the difference between life and death, between parity and domination. It was proof that wars are not only won by courage or tactics, but by knowledge, by factories, and by the invisible miracles of science. Years later, one surviving P-51 pilot recalled that feeling. When you pushed the throttle forward and the boost climbed, you could feel America behind you, the refineries, the welders, the girls on the assembly lines, the chemists in their labs. You weren't just flying a plane, you were flying a nation. The story of grade 150 fuel isn't just about octane or horsepower. It's about how the combined will of free nations could turn crude oil into air superiority and air superiority into victory. It is about a small, simple truth that echoes through history: speed means choice. A faster fighter can decide when to fight and when to live. In 1944 and 1945, that choice belonged to the Allies, and it was written in purple. As the last Mustangs of the war glided home over a defeated Germany, their engines rumbling softly in the evening air, the men who flew them knew what that sound meant. It was the sound of a machine and a civilization running on brilliance. A faint shimmer of violet on a pilot's glove, the smell of leaded fuel still hanging in the wind. A quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons in history aren't made of steel or fire, but of ideas, chemistry, and courage. When I look back at that winter morning in 1944, a single test flight over Ohio changing the course of a World War I, can't help but feel awe. Not just at the Mustang's power, but at the minds that made it possible. It reminds me that victory isn't always forged on the battlefield. Sometimes it's born in a lab in quiet moments of brilliance. That purple fuel wasn't just gasoline. It was proof of what human determination and ingenuity can do when everything is at stake. If you enjoyed this story and want more untold chapters of World War II, like this, hit subscribe and stay with me. We've got many more skies left to explore.